For the vast majority of history enthusiasts, there seems to be an interesting phenomenon when it comes to the Tang Dynasty. People tend to be quite familiar with the Tang Dynasty before the Lushan Rebellion. But after the rebellion, the Tang Dynasty seems to fade into obscurity. The fundamental reason for this is that the early Tang Dynasty was simply too glorious, standing as a major highlight in the entire history of China. Because people know so much about the early Tang Dynasty, their knowledge of the middle and late Tang periods is somewhat limited, making this part of history feel less significant. The history of the Tang Dynasty must begin with the noble Li Yuan from the Sui Dynasty. During the Sui Dynasty, the founding emperor, Yang Jian, had an empress from the Dugu family, who had a nephew, Li Yuan. Li Yuan came from a distinguished and powerful family. Besides being the emperor's nephew, his family, the Li clan, was at the core of the Guanlong aristocratic group and held significant influence in the Sui dynasty. By the late Sui period, large-scale rebellions erupted across the empire, and various regional warlords began to rise in revolt. At the time, Li Yuan, who was in his early 50s, was serving as an official in the Shaanxi region, holding both military and political power in the area. As the Sui dynasty collapsed completely, Li Yuan led his forces on a rapid advance covering thousands of miles, capturing Chang'an within just a few months. He took control of the entire city and subsequently secured the whole Guanzhong region. A little over 6 months later, Li Yuan officially proclaimed himself emperor, marking the founding of the Tang Dynasty. After establishing the Tang Dynasty, the next task was naturally to unify the country. However, since Li Yuan had already declared himself emperor, it was impossible for him to personally lead military campaigns. At the same time, he could not allow his generals to wield too much power, because if a general were to conquer all of China, then Li Yuan would have to hand over the entire country to him. Thus, the best choice was to let his own sons fight on his behalf. At that time, Li Yuan had 3 sons, the eldest, Li Jiancheng, the second son, Li Shimin, and the youngest, Li Yuanji. Li Jiancheng had already been granted the title of crown prince, meaning he could not leave the court to lead an army. Li Yuanji, being too young and lacking military training, was primarily tasked with defending the capital. As a result, the responsibility of leading the army naturally fell upon Li Shimin. Fortunately, Li Shimin proved to be an exceptional military commander. Over the next 4 years, he successively defeated northern warlords such as Shui Ju, Lu Wuzhou, Wang Shishang, Dou Jiande, and Lu Haida. Almost all of the major northern battles that led to the Tang dynasty's dominance were won by Li Shimin. For this reason, as Li Shimin gradually secured control over the north, his father, Emperor Li Yuan, began to see him as a threat and started restricting his military authority. This is why, when it came to unifying the south, Li Shimin was largely absent, and another extraordinary general, Li Jing, was assigned the task instead. Li Jing was one of the most outstanding generals of the time, no less skilled than Li Shimin. As a result, within just over a year, the Tang dynasty had largely pacified the south. With the unification of the south, the entire Central Plains region was once again consolidated under Tang rule. However, at this point, a new problem arose, since most of the hard battles in the north had been fought by Li Shimin. The prestige of Crown Prince Li Jiancheng was significantly weaker in comparison. This created instability in the heir's position. Over the next 2 years, Li Shimin, as the leader of the Qin faction, actively sought to claim the position of Crown Prince, leading to an escalating rivalry with Li Jiancheng. After more than 2 years of fierce conflict, when both sides had reached the point of no return, Li Shimin finally took decisive action. He ambushed his brothers outside the Xuanwu Gate of the imperial palace, killing them, and then forced Li Yuan to abdicate in his favor. Just like that, the Tang dynasty transitioned from the era of Li Yuan to the era of Li Shimin. Although his means of seizing the throne were not entirely legitimate, Li Shimin proved to be an exceptionally capable emperor. After ascending the throne, Li Shimin quickly restored the Tang dynasty's national strength, bringing the empire back from the chaos of the late Sui dynasty. At the same time, he focused on developing Tang's military power and began expanding outward. The only regret was that, as emperor, he could no longer personally lead troops in battle. Thus, the responsibility for Tang's military expansion fell to another top-tier general, Li Jing. Over the next decade, Li Jing led Tang forces to pacify the Western Turkic Khaganate in the north and the Tuyuhun in the northwest. These two wars secured Tang's northern borders for over a century, ensuring that no major threats emerged from the region. After these victories, the Tang dynasty continued its expansion, targeting Goguryeo in the northeast and the western Turkic territories in Central Asia. However, these regions were too far from the core of Tang's administration. During his reign, Li Shimin launched a campaign against Goguryeo, successfully defeating its forces, but he was unable to completely destroy the kingdom. Following this, the Tang dynasty shifted toward a more sustainable strategy, gradually strengthening its own national power while continuously harassing and weakening these distant regimes. This plan was implemented for a period of time, but as Li Shimin's health began to decline, he was forced to consider the issue of succession. Over the next decade, the pace of Tang's expansion slowed, as political focus shifted to internal matters. When Li Ji ascended the throne, he solidified his power by making Wu Zetian his empress, thereby suppressing the influence of veteran officials and securing full control over the government. Only then did the Tang dynasty resume its expansion. During Li Ji's reign, another formidable general, Su Dingfang, emerged. Under Su Dingfang's leadership, the Tang dynasty annihilated both the Western Turkic Khaganate and Goguryeo. Additionally, in the Battle of Baekgang, Tang forces decisively defeated the Japanese. By the time these campaigns concluded, the Tang dynasty had eliminated all nearby rivals. The Tibetan Empire on the plateau, as well as the Turkic and Uyghur tribes on the steppe, all submitted to Tang authority and accepted Tang rule. By the mid-reign of Li Ji, the Tang dynasty had reached its territorial zenith. However, as the empire's territory grew larger, two major problems emerged. First, the vast land required permanent military garrisons along the borders. The traditional military system, known as the Fubing system, began to fail. From the late reign of Li Ji and for several decades afterward, the Tang administration continuously reformed its military structure. Since border regions required long-term military presence, troops were permanently stationed there. Because logistics were difficult, military farms were established along the frontier. Since native Tang soldiers were unwilling to serve on the border, local nomadic warriors were recruited instead. As battles grew larger in scale, individual generals were granted full authority over entire military regions. To facilitate their command, both financial and administrative powers were gradually transferred to these generals. Over time, these reforms led to the emergence of the Jiedushi, military governors, and the Fantowns, regional military provinces. The second major problem was the rise of the Tibetan Empire. As Tibet expanded, the Tang dynasty initially tried to suppress it. However, during the Battle of Defei River, internal political struggles within Tang weakened its forces, leading to the defeat of the renowned general Shui Rengui at the hands of the Tibetans. After this defeat, the Tang dynasty was no longer able to contain Tibet, which gradually became a serious rival, competing with Tang for control over the western regions. At this time, however, the Tang dynasty was still at its peak, and external threats were not considered a primary concern. However, toward the late reign of Li Ji, as Wu Zetian began consolidating power, the Tang dynasty entered a prolonged period of internal strife that lasted for 30 years. During this period, the focus of Tang history shifted from external expansion to internal political struggles. The first major change occurred when Li Ji passed away. Wu Zetian, as Empress Dowager, took control of the government and supported her son, Li Xian, in ascending the throne. However, to consolidate her own power, Wu Zetian soon orchestrated a coup, deposing Li Xian and replacing him with another of her sons, Li Dan. In the years that followed, Li Dan was essentially a puppet ruler, while Wu Zetian held absolute power. Finally, in the year 690, Wu Zetian forced Li Dan to abdicate and ascended the throne herself, becoming the only female emperor in Chinese history. Wu Zetian ruled for 15 years, during which the Tang dynasty largely ceased external expansion. and rebellions began to emerge in various regions. However, Wu Zetian had a strong political grip and managed to suppress these uprisings. Although the territory of the empire slightly shrank compared to the reign of Li Ji, she was able to maintain most of it. Toward the later years of her reign, Wu Zetian contemplated the future and decided that it would be best to return the throne to her son after her death. Thus, she reinstated Li Xian, whom she had previously deposed. After Li Xian returned, Wu Zetian gradually indulged in luxury and favored her male concubines. Eventually, in the year 705, Prime Minister Zhang Jianji, along with several high-ranking officials, launched a coup, eliminated Wu Zetian's favored concubines, and forced her to abdicate in favor of Li Xian. This event became known in history as the Shenlong coup. Less than a year after the coup, Wu Zetian passed away, and Li Xian successfully ascended the throne. However, after ruling for only a few years, Li Xian was killed by his own wife, Empress Wei, who then placed Li Xian's youngest son on the throne in an attempt to become a second Wu Zetian. At this critical moment, Li Dan's son, Li Longji, joined forces with Li Dan's sister, Princess Taiping, to launch another coup, overthrowing Empress Wei. Li Dan was then reinstated as emperor. But a power struggle soon emerged between Li Longji and Princess Taiping. To pacify the conflict between his son and sister, Li Dan eventually chose to abdicate. But the struggle continued. In the end, after Li Longji ascended the throne, he acted swiftly and launched another coup to eliminate Princess Taiping. It was only at this point that Li Longji fully seized control, bringing an end to the decades-long internal strife that had plagued the Tang Dynasty. With Li Longji firmly in power, history entered the famous era of the Kaiyuan Golden Age. Despite the persistent internal struggles among the ruling elite over the past few decades, the general population and the lower levels of the empire remained relatively unaffected. The economy remained strong, and people's livelihoods were stable. Therefore, after taking full control, Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, Li Longji, quickly led the empire into further prosperity. He subdued several neighboring regimes, including the Tibetan Empire on the plateau, which he managed to suppress completely. However, during this period, Tang Xuanzong once again faced the long-standing issue of the military system's collapse. He was forced to implement comprehensive reforms, further improving the military governance structure and the system of military governors, jiadushi, that had been gradually established by his predecessors. To reduce the financial burden on the state, Tang Xuanzong made a key decision, reducing the size of the standing army within the empire and deploying elite troops exclusively to border regions. As a result, by the mid-reign of Tang Xuanzong, the Tang dynasty found itself in a precarious situation. The interior of the empire was left defenseless, while elite forces were stationed at the borders under the control of powerful military governors. Once this situation took shape, the outbreak of the Inlushan rebellion seemed inevitable. In the year 755, Inlushan launched his rebellion, and his forces quickly overran northern China. As the rebellion spread, Tang Xuanzong fled to Sichuan. His crown prince, Li Heng, took command and began organizing a military response. Upon the recommendation of his generals, Li Heng declared himself emperor, taking the throne as Emperor Suzong of Tang. Meanwhile, Tang Xuanzong was reduced to the status of retired emperor, Taishang Huang. Over the next 8 years, the Tang dynasty, relying on its vast resources, struggled to suppress the Inlushan rebellion. However, to achieve victory, the Tang court was forced to empower regional military governors further and offer autonomy to former rebel commanders who surrendered. By the time the rebellion was finally quelled 8 years later, the Tang dynasty had not only transitioned from its peak into decline but had also laid the foundation for the future fragmentation of the empire, as military governors gained increasing autonomy. Furthermore, at the same time that the Inlushan rebellion was finally suppressed, both Tang Xuanzong and Tang Suzong passed away in the same year. After the death of Tang Suzong, his son, Li Yu, ascended the throne as Emperor Daizong of Tang. With Emperor Daizong's accession, the Inlushan rebellion was officially over, and Tang history entered the Middle and Late Tang periods. From this point onward, many people became less familiar with Tang history. However, the Middle Tang period after Emperor Daizong can be summarized by 10 temple titles: Dai, De, Shun, Xie, Mu, Jane, Wen, Wu, Zan, and Yi. These 10 characters represent the next 10 Tang emperors. The history of the Middle Tang period unfolded as follows. First, during the reign of Emperor Daizong, after the Lushan rebellion was pacified, the most pressing issue was not eliminating the military governor's growing autonomy but addressing invasions by the Tibetan Empire and the Uyghurs while preventing key generals from rebelling. And so, the struggle continued. During the reign of Emperor Taizong of Tang, he successfully repelled foreign invasions and quelled the rebellion of Guo Huaiying. It can be said that Emperor Taizong accomplished a great deal during his rule. As for the issue of military governors, jiedushi, and regional warlords, it had not yet become a critical problem during his time, and its importance was relatively lower. More importantly, in order to deal with external threats, Emperor Daizong of Tang still had to rely on the jiedushi under him. However, after Emperor Daizong, the next emperor, Emperor Dezong of Tang, was the first to truly confront the problem of the autonomous military governors. By the time of Emperor Dezong's reign, the first generation of jiedushi who had risen to power during the Lushan rebellion had reached old age. Many of them wanted their positions to be inherited by their children. Naturally, Emperor Dezong could not allow this and directly refused their demands. However, this rejection provoked strong resistance from the jiedushi. These powerful military governors were not easily controlled, especially those in the Yuzhou region. Many of them were originally followers of Lushan and had only surrendered to the Tang Dynasty after being persuaded. Even after their defection, they maintained a high degree of autonomy. As a result, these jiedushi soon launched a rebellion, an event later known as the Crisis of Fengtian. Although the Crisis of Fengtian was not as famous as the Lushan rebellion, its impact on the Tang Dynasty was nearly as devastating. At the worst moment of the conflict, Emperor Dezong was even forced to flee from Chang'an. Fortunately, at that time, the Tang Dynasty still had significant resources, and in the end, the rebellion was suppressed. However, the problem of military governors was not resolved. In fact, it became even more serious. Emperor Dezong was able to suppress the rebellion mainly because he further recognized the independence of certain jiedushi. As a result, after Emperor Dezong's reign, while some of the most powerful military governors were eliminated and the Tibetan threat was repelled, the overall independence of regional warlords increased. After Emperor Dezong's death, the power of the jiedushi reached its peak. His successor, Emperor Shunzong of Tang, merely hinted at an intention to curb the power of the military governors. But he immediately faced resistance from both the court aristocrats and the jiedushi. Ultimately, he had no choice but to abdicate after only 200 days on the throne, passing the empire to his son, Emperor Shenzong of Tang. Although Emperor Shenzong ascended the throne at a young age, he proved to be a highly capable ruler. Upon reaching adulthood, he quickly consolidated central authority and took firm control over the government. Before dealing with the jiedushi, Emperor Shenzong first contemplated a crucial question. Why had his three predecessors all failed to resolve the problem of regional warlords? Why had each attempt to curb their power only resulted in the jiedushi becoming stronger and more independent? Emperor Shenzong came to a straightforward conclusion. His predecessors had always suppressed one faction of warlords by supporting another. This was largely because the old Fubing military system had completely collapsed. And under the existing Tang administrative structure, previous emperors had no choice but to use one group of warlords to defeat another. However, once a new faction of jiedushi gained power, they would expand and become another problem. This created a vicious cycle. With this understanding, Emperor Shenzong devised a new strategy. Instead of relying on jiedushi, he decided to establish a powerful central army. Based on this idea, he formed the elite Shent's army, a strong imperial force directly under his control. With this powerful military backing, Emperor Shenzong quickly crushed several of the most rebellious jiedushi. Seeing how strong the Tang central government had become, other military governors had no choice but to submit. Emperor Shenzong was able to reclaim financial and administrative powers that had previously been held by the Jiedushi. By this point, Emperor Shenzong had already achieved more than half of his goal of weakening the warlords. This period became known as the Yuanhe Restoration, during which the regional warlords were largely subdued and external enemies were decisively repelled. However, when it came to the fundamental issue of completely eliminating the Jiedushi system, Emperor Shenzong encountered an insurmountable problem. He had the power to remove the military governors, but he could not deal with the old soldiers serving under them. If Emperor Shenzong forcibly disbanded the Jiedushi armies, it would result in thousands of professional soldiers losing their livelihood. If he continued to support them, the Tang treasury would not be able to sustain the financial burden. On the other hand, if he simply dismissed these troops, they would likely turn into bandits, destabilizing the entire empire and potentially causing the collapse of the Tang Dynasty. Ultimately, Emperor Shenzong was unable to resolve the problem of the warlords because he could not find a way to deal with their soldiers. The best way to handle the issue of re-employment for retired soldiers was to maintain the system of military governors, Jiedushi, while ensuring that the central government controlled these regional warlords through a strong imperial army, as well as financial and personnel authority. However, by the later years of Emperor Shenzong of Tang, a new issue emerged. Who exactly should control the powerful Shen's army? Emperor Shenzong did not even trust his own sons with it. After all, if such an army were handed over to a single individual, a dynastic change could happen at any moment. Ultimately, he decided to entrust the command of the Shen's army to the eunuchs. From the reign of Emperor Shenzong onward, the Tang dynasty took on a new political structure. There was a balance of power between the central government and the Jiedushi, while eunuchs, who controlled the military, gained the ability to manipulate or even overshadow the emperor. This solidified the issues of eunuch dominance and warlord rule in the mid to late Tang dynasty. After Emperor Shenzong, the next 6 emperors, Muzong, Jingzong, Wenzong, Wuzong, Xuanzong, and Yizong, mainly focused on maintaining this delicate balance. If an emperor could successfully navigate the struggle between the eunuchs and the warlords, he could be considered a competent ruler, such as Emperor Wuzong and Emperor Xuanzong. However, if an emperor failed at this balancing act, he risked being completely sidelined or even killed by the eunuchs. Despite their immense power, eunuchs could never declare themselves emperors due to their unique status. At most, they could only install another member of the Li imperial family as a puppet ruler. Eventually, such eunuchs would also be purged. Under this strange and precarious balance, the Tang dynasty managed to survive for nearly another century. However, by the late reign of Emperor Yizong of Tang, a new crisis arose, the peasant uprisings. By that time, the Tang dynasty had been established for over 200 years, and land monopolization had become a severe issue. As a result, ordinary peasants had no means of survival and had no choice but to rise in rebellion. As these peasant uprisings erupted, they introduced a fourth power faction into the struggle for control of the empire, completely disrupting the balance that had been maintained for over a century. With this equilibrium shattered, the Jiedushi became fully independent, even more so than during the Inlushan Rebellion. Meanwhile, the eunuchs completely sidelined the emperor, taking full control of the Tang central government. However, it was not long before the Huangchao Rebellion broke out. Huangchao's rebel army marched straight into Chang'an, utterly destroying the Tang imperial army. With the central army wiped out, the eunuchs lost their foundation of power, leading to the final collapse of eunuch influence in the Tang court. Yet, at the same time, the Tang central government also disintegrated entirely. Following Emperor Yizong, the next 2 emperors, Emperor Zhaozong and Emperor Aizong, were nothing more than figureheads. Emperor Aizong, in particular, became a mere puppet under the control of the Jiedushi Zhu Wen. By this point, there was no hope left for the Tang dynasty. In the year 907, Zhu Wen forced Emperor Aizong to abdicate, marking the end of the Tang dynasty, which had lasted for 289 years. However, because Zhu Wen himself failed to unify the country and other Jiedushi remained powerful, the fall of the Tang dynasty did not lead to a new centralized empire. Instead, it ushered in an even more chaotic period known as the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms. Looking at the history of the Tang Dynasty, it is not difficult to see why the late Tang period feels less significant to many people. The fundamental reason is that the early Tang was overwhelmingly powerful, with legendary figures dominating its history. Compared to other dynasties like the Han, Song, and Yuan, the later years of the Tang dynasty were fairly typical in terms of decline and internal strife. However, because the early Tang dynasty shone so brightly, people tend to assume that the Tang dynasty was always strong, which makes them overlook the mid to late Tang period. This is the true historical reality of the Tang dynasty.